Hello. I wanted to talk to you today about Audre Lorde's Zami, which I assume all of you have read by now and hopefully enjoyed. I thought it would be useful to have some context for the book. So, whether you're watching this prior to reading the book or after reading the book, hopefully it will enrich your understanding of Audre Lorde's work and also have you thinking about not only her contribution to the literary canon, but how her life and events have influenced other writers and are thinking about intersectionality. Audre Lorde was born in 1934 and lived until 1992. And to understand her work and its impact, I thought it would be useful to go back to Harlem in the 1930s, which is the world that she grew up in. So she was born just as the Harlem Renaissance was considered ending. The neighborhood was an artistic boomtown during the Harlem Renaissance, um, home to a slew of famous artists who mingled in clubs, restaurants, living rooms, and lecture halls. Some of the famous artists affiliated with the Harlem Renaissance include Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Marcus Garvey, Louis Armstrong. The Cotton Club was, of course, in its heyday. Musicians like Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, Cab Calloway, Pat Waller, Paul Robeson, Josephine Baker played there at the Cotton Club and in clubs all over Harlem, and indeed all over New York and the world. And most were either living full time in Harlem or were there much of the time performing and reading and trading ideas about life and, of course, civil rights. This person in the upper left-hand corner is Zora Neale Hurston. I imagine most of you are familiar with her work. One of her most famous novels is, of course, Their Eyes Were Watching God. I'm going to offer a brief aside here because I was down reporting on the then forthcoming presidential election in January 2019 in a town called Sanford, Florida, when I discovered that Audre Lorde grew up there. And this was her house, which, as you can see, is boarded up and vacant, totally abandoned. I'm sorry to say that in the days that I spent, wandering around this town while I was reporting, I saw not a single placard or statue or tribute dedicated to Zora Neale Hurston here. I did find some information in the tiny little town museum, but her history is basically erased there, which is a really sad state of affairs, as she's an amazing writer, and it speaks to some of the issues that Audre Lorde explored about the lack of credence and respect for Black artists. So, going back to Audre Lorde. She was born just as the Harlem Renaissance was dying out. The Harlem Renaissance is considered as dating from 1910 to about 1933. Then the stock market crash and the end of Prohibition in 1933 meant that many of those who hung out in Harlem and got whiskey and went to the clubs, etc., were no longer doing that. Add to that the race riots in 1935, and this took a toll on much of the artistic movement and some of the gorgeous architecture up there. Harlem really grew during the Great Migration, which is when many of the Southern African Americans from the rural areas of the South came to get jobs in the industrial North. A lot of that was documented by the Works Progress Administration and the Farm Security Administration. So some of these pictures that you'll see in the presentation are from the National Archives there. And we'll return to some of those WPA photographs next week in my talk about W.G. Sebald. Others here are by the photographer Carl Van Vechten, who lived in Harlem and photographed many of the luminaries up there. This picture is Harlem in the 1940s with some boys that are collecting and sorting cans. Another thing that would have been impacting Lorde's childhood is the return of the black soldiers after World War II. They arrived back in the U.S. with different expectations about civil life and Black people's rights and roles in society. All of that was the backdrop for her growing up in Harlem in the 30s and the 40s. Because her memoir begins in early childhood, age 3 or 4, with her first memory, there isn't a lot of reason to go into those particulars. They are the heart and soul of this memoir. But where it leaves off is a really interesting part of where Lorde went from her days in the village as a young woman to become a very outspoken and famous activist and literary figure on the New York scene and also ultimately internationally. So first off, as she is starting to do when this book ends, she gets involved in the anti-war movement. She also gets involved in the very, very early days of feminism and the women's liberation movement, and of course, the civil rights movement. Here is one of her quotes about activism. Those of us who stand outside the circle of the society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbian, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill, and it's learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. You probably recognize that very famous quote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And now you know where that quote comes from. It's Audre Lorde. In order to get a sense of Lorde's powerful voice as she spoke about these issues, I'll link to a brief excerpt of her speaking. This is a 1-minute quote from her.
For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial, alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways, coming and going in the hours between dawn, looking inward and outward at once, before and after, seeking nows that can breed future. I remembered all of those particular things. I started writing because I had a need inside of me to create something that was not there. Now you say you're lonely. You cry the whole I was editor of my high school magazine, and I wrote a poem about love. And the student advisor, the faculty advisor, said it was a bad sonnet. And I really knew that it was a good one, you see, but I knew that she didn't like it because of the things that I said in it. So I sent it off to 17 magazine and they bought it. And I made more money from that one poem than I made for the next 10 years.
Lorde explored as she grew older was this notion of the individual versus the collective history. Only in her mind, it wasn't so much versus as an and, the individual and the collective history. So, as you probably noticed from reading her work, it's of course very, very personal in this memoir, but she was also one of the early feminists who were interested in connecting the idea of the personal to the political. We hear that phrase bandied about all the time now, but in those early days it meant something very different, which was looking at, say, the home in terms of who does the cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Women who felt like they were overwhelmed and were inclined to blame themselves for their lack of efficiency or poor mothering skills. At the time, they blamed themselves and thought something was wrong with them, and the women's magazines were full of self-help tips, etc., etc. But then in the 60s and the 70s, they began to look outward through a feminist lens to say, oh, okay, well, there are some larger political and cultural forces at work here. And why won't my husband change the diapers? They began to realize it's not just me struggling with these issues. So Lorde was in on the early conversation about that sort of stuff. The personal is political, and the idea of individual histories and communal histories were themes that would surface a lot throughout Lorde's life. And she focused her discussion of difference not only on the differences between groups of women, but between conflicting differences within the individual. She wrote, "I'm defined as other in every group I'm a part of." She wrote that without community, there is certainly no liberation, no future, only the most vulnerable and temporary armistice between me and my oppression. She described herself both as part of a continuum of women and a concert of voices within herself. Perception of her many layers of selfhood is replicated in the multi-genres of her work. Critic Carmen Burkle wrote, "Her multicultural self is thus reflected in a multicultural text in multi-genres in which the individual cultures are no longer separate and autonomous entities, but melt into a larger whole without losing their individual importance." That long before the term intersectionality was coined, Lorde was describing this very concept, insisting there was no hierarchy of oppression. She wrote, "Once we deal with those differences, we do it in a context of, hey, we can use these differences. We don't have to eradicate those differences. We don't have to wipe them out. We also don't have to remain with them. There is a total larger picture. In other words, I'm talking about the creative use of difference." And she defines herself: Black, lesbian, feminist, mother, warrior, poet. One of the things Lorde did as she got older was to work as a teacher, which is ultimately how she would spend most of her life, teaching at various universities, mostly Hunter College in New York City. But the first life-changing experience for her as a teacher was when she went to Mississippi and began to teach students at the university there. In the Deep South, she said, "I came to see, first to feel, then to see, then to share the fact that my poetry was, and theirs by extension, a part of our weaponry." There's an excerpt I'm going to share showing how she went from her prominent role among the feminists in the U.S. to carry that fight for feminism and LGBTQ rights to various international cities, including Berlin. Here's a brief excerpt. It's a trailer for a documentary by a German filmmaker.
I come here to read my poetry tonight as a Black feminist, lesbian, poet.
Und am Schluss der Vorlesung, da sagte sie dann so, sie möchte jetzt, dass alle weißen Frauen den Raum verlassen und die schwarzen Frauen im Saal bleiben und dass keine aus dem Saal geht, bevor sie nicht mit einer anderen schwarzen Frau gesprochen hat.
Ihre Initiative war, uns zu vermitteln, ihr müsst euch zusammentun und zeigen, dass ihr da seid und eure Stimme erheben, jede auf ihre Art.
I've never thought of Afro-German as a positive concept before, she said, speaking out of the pain of having to live a difference that has no name.
Ich glaube, mir hat niemand so viel Mut gemacht und so viel mir meine eigene Verantwortlichkeit aufgezeigt und damit auch die Möglichkeit, etwas zu tun wie Audre. She believes that a revolution is made by people and by people who are many individuals. And she's always, again, capable of seeing the individual and of really putting a point on her finger on things.
Racism in Germany, Switzerland, in Europe must become an issue for white feminists because it is part of your lives. It affects your lives in every way. And the fact that you are not people of color does not make you safe from the effects of it. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah. Verstehst du, was
I do.
Ja.
I do.
Feel a real lift in coming to Berlin. I think that the women's movement in Berlin is, how do you say, stark, and it has a lot of life and vitality. And it makes my heart sing to see what is possible.
Berlin added years onto Audre's life, and this is something that I know her stateside public is not aware of. That's the role, how Berlin literally added years to her life.
This is a list of some of her work so that you can get a sense of how prolific she was as a writer. Look up her poetry. Here's an excerpt I'd like to share with you. It's from a poem she wrote called On My Way Out, I Passed Over You and the Verrazano Bridge. If you're not familiar with the Verrazano Bridge, that bridge goes from Staten Island to Brooklyn in New York City. And the poem reads, History is not kind to us. We restitch it with living, past memory, forward into desire, into the panic, articulation of want without having, or even the promise of getting. And I dream of our coming together, encircled, driven, not only by love, but by lust for a working tomorrow. The flights of this journey, mapless, uncertain, and necessary as water. An audio excerpt with you. This one is a bit longer, but I was struck by how radical her ideas still seem in many ways, even today, and how the discussions that she was involved in still really resonate in our cultural conversations. And just to give you some context, she's talking about the erotic, and this notion of the erotic as power came out of a conversation that was going on, particularly among the New York feminist communities, between the anti-pornography feminists and their opponents who embraced a pro-sex ideology. There were lots of different groups on both sides, but the anti-pornography ones were led by Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin. Andrea Dworkin's argument was that all sex between a man and a woman was inherently violent, involving penetration, as it usually does, and therefore, in some ways, it is always rape. She would go on to work with legal scholar Catherine McKinnon to create legislation that restricted access to pornography or allowed people to file civil complaints against pornography. Historically, pornography was banned in various fashions and in various periods under obscenity laws. But Dworkin and McKinnon's sweeping restrictions challenged censorship protections, and opponents insisted that the restrictions that the pair proposed were so vast that huge swaths of what we consider classics in painting or in sculpture or in literature would be banished to the trash heap of history. Inside and outside the feminist community, there was a backlash from people who felt like that was a violation of the right to free speech. So, all of this was in the air as Audre Lorde wrote this next piece that I'm going to share with you. And it makes sense to interpret this as her response to the debate that was going on among various women's groups. I'll play it for about 4 or 5 minutes because it's interesting and it takes a few moments to really understand her argument. And of course, it's nice to hear her voice reading her own words. So just sit back and listen for a few minutes. It's just an audio clip with a still image.
What I wanted to speak to today is another aspect or the opposite of pornographic, because it's really hard. I know it is for me, and I'm sure it is for you,
Andrea Dworkin yesterday spoke about the necessity of our knowing our enemy. Well, in order to know our enemy, we have to expose ourselves to some really energy sapping things. And to do that, we need all the strength we can get. We need each one of us to deal from a place where we are most powerful. And what I wanted to talk about today was the erotic as a source of that power, and how urgent it is that we recognize that within ourselves and that we not confuse the pornographic with the erotic. The name of this is uses of the erotic is power. Now, there are many kinds of power, both the ones we use and the ones we do not yet use, acknowledged and otherwise. The erotic is a resource within each one of us that lies in a very deeply female and spiritual plane. It is firmly rooted in the power of all our unexpressed and unrecognized feelings. In order to perpetrate itself, every oppression in our history must corrupt or distort those various sources of power within the culture of the oppressed, as for instance, within our culture as women, that can provide energy for change. Now, for women, this has meant the suppression of the erotic as a considered source of our power and information within our lives. We have been taught to suspect this resource. It has been vilified, abused, and devalued within Western society. On one hand, the superficially erotic has been encouraged as a sign of our inferiority. On the other hand, women have been made to suffer and to feel contemptible and suspect by virtue of its existence. So actually, it's a very short step from there to the very false belief that it is only by the suppression of the erotic within our lives and our consciousness that women can be truly strong. But that kind of strength is illusory. It is not real because it is fashioned within the context of a male model of power. As women, we have often come to distrust that power which rises from our deepest and non-rational knowledge, because of course we have been warned against it all our lives by a male world which values this depth of feeling enough to keep women around in order to exercise it in their service, but which fears this same depth too much to examine the possibilities of it within themselves. So in this case, women are maintained at a distant and inferior position, psychically milked, much the same way that ants maintain colonies of aphids to provide a life-giving substance for the masters. But the erotic offers a well of replenishing and provocative force to any woman who does not fear its revelation, nor succumb to the belief that sensation is enough. The erotic has been misnamed and used against us. It has been made into the confused, the trivial, the psychotic, the pornographic, the plasticized sensation. And for this reason, we have often turned away from the exploration and consideration of the erotic as a source of power and information. We have confused it with the opposite, the pornographic. But pornography is a direct denial of the power of the erotic, for it represents the suppression of all true feeling. Pornography emphasizes sensation without feeling. And the erotic is a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos and power of our deepest feelings. It is an internal sense of satisfaction to which once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. Once having experienced the fullness of this depth of feeling and recognized its power, in honor and self-respect, we can require no less of ourselves. Now, it is never easy to demand the most from ourselves, from our lives, from our work. To go beyond the encouraged mediocrity of the society that we live in is always fraught with danger and with fear. And the function of the erotic is to encourage excellence.
I've spent the last week or two reading Audre Lorde's memoir, And this is a instance where I think we're seeing the writer in her younger form, or hearing from her when she's writing about her youth. This is basically her coming of age story. But we're actually able to check in with her throughout her life to see where she went with those seeds that she was germinating, with these ideas and experiences that she's just beginning to explore in her memoir. We get a sense of how they shaped her politics and her writing. Now, to turn to Zami, a new spelling of my name. The 1982 biomythography explores some interesting ideas, and one of them that I would like us to focus on as we move into a discussion about craft, something worth zeroing in on in the text, is when she begins to speculate about her mother's homeland, this island that she actually thought wasn't a real place. Once home was a far way off, a place I had never been to, but knew well out of my mother's mouth. She breathed, exuded, hummed the fruit smell of Knowles Hill, morning fresh and noon hot, and I spun visions of sapodillo and mango as a net over my Harlem tenement cot, in the snoring darkness and with nighttime sweat, made bearable because it was not all. This now, here, was a space, some temporary abode, never to be considered, forever, not totally binding nor defining, no matter how much it commanded in energy and attention. For if we all lived correctly and with frugality, looked both ways before crossing the street, then someday we would arrive back in the sweet place, back home. Ma Divine, Friending, Zami, how Carriacou women love each other is legend in Grenada, and so is their strength and their beauty. All three of those terms are slang for lesbian in the Caribbean. And then she goes on to write, here Aunt Annie lived among the other women who saw their men off on the sailing vessels, then tended the goats and the ground nuts, planted grain and poured rum upon the earth to strengthen the corn's growing, built their women's houses and the rainwater catchments, harvested the limes, wove their lives and the lives of their children together. Women who survived the absence of their seafaring men easily because they came to love each other, past the men's returning. Carriacou, a magic name like cinnamon, nutmeg, mace, the delectable little squares of guava jelly, each lovingly wrapped in tiny bits of crazy quilt wax paper cut precisely from bread wrappers, the long sticks of dried vanilla, and the sweet-smelling tonka bean, chalky brown nuggets of pressed chocolate for cocoa tea, all set on a bed of wild bay laurel leaves, arriving every Christmas time in a well-wrapped tea tin. Then she goes on, Carriacou, which was not listed in the index of the Good Schools Atlas, nor in the Junior Americana World Gazette, nor appeared on any map that I could find. And so when I hunted for the magic place during geography lessons or in free time at the library, I never found it, and came to believe my mother's geography was a fantasy, or crazy, or at least too old-fashioned. And in reality, maybe she was talking about the place other people called Caracau, a Dutch possession on the other side of the Antilles. Home? But underneath it all, as I was growing up, home was still a sweet place somewhere else, which they had not managed to capture yet on paper, nor to throttle and bind up between the pages of a school book. It was our own, my truly private paradise of blugo and breadfruit hanging from the trees, of nutmeg and lime and sapodillo, of tonka beans and red and yellow paradise plums. Feminist scholar Kate King writes of these layers of meaning, layers of history, layers of readings and rereadings through webs of power-charged codes marked biomythography, and the layerings of instance of political meanings constrained in particularity, lacquered over so finely that they're inseparable and mutually constructing while distinct. So, breaking it down. Notice the way that Lorde leans on these repetitions and lists to explore variations on each of these things, her theme, and the ways in which she layers language and description, linking it to the way that she's emphasizing complexities and the different perspectives and the fact that no one person is just one thing. This is clearly one of the themes running through this memoir, but it's echoed in a very structural way in her writing. For example, if you break down those passages I just read aloud to you, here you can see how she uses the repetition of words. Home, home. She's using alliteration quite a bit. My mother's mouth, and also lists. Even here, she breathed, exuded, hummed, with no commas, so they're almost not even sequential. They're all given a kind of equal weight because of the way she's done this. And this is rife with such lists. Here's another one, highlighted in blue. This second passage, she's not just going to name home as one thing. It's not that easy. She says, it's like a space, some temporary abode, never to be considered forever, nor totally binding, nor defining, no matter how much it commanded in energy and attention. You can see how she used these lists throughout, even in just this one brief passage, to convey a multidimensional sense of place, with both what is and what is not ceded equal importance, and how this sense of a multiplicity, multiple ways of seeing, echoes her ideas about identity that she's exploring in this book, the intersectionality, and that indeed she'd go on to explore her whole life. Similarly, for the word repetitions in yellow here, notice how they create a sense of momentum, the same and yet different based on the altered context. See, it's not always the exact same word, but they can be similar sounding or referencing each other. Even in just this passage, wrapped, wrappers, wrapped. We have sweet here on this page and the next one where home is a sweet place. And again the lists. Her geography was, quote, a fantasy or crazy or at least too old-fashioned. Passage with home and with sweet. And again with this ending list. So notice that she did this when she was talking about the most mundane things and when she was exploring the most elevated moments. Here in this passage, I don't know if you remember this part, but she's up in whatever town it was in Connecticut, and she's with her friend Ginger, who is soon to be her lover. She's shopping for nylons, right? And she writes in this passage, I ran my fingers over the fine mesh of the display stockings hung from a tea rack on the counter. The dry, slippery touch of nylon and silk filled me with distrust and suspicion. The effortlessness with which those materials passed through my fingers made me uneasy. They were elusive, confusing, not to be depended upon. Most of all, I hated the pungent, lifeless, and unyielding smell of nylon, its adamant refusal to become human or evocative in odor. Its harshness was never tampered by the smell of the wearer. No matter how long the clothing was worn, nor in what weather, a person dressed in nylons always approached my nose like a warrior approaching a tourney, clad in chainmail. This is a technique she's clearly drawn to, and again, whether it's as mundane as thinking about nylons or talking about her first sexual encounter, for example, in this passage, she writes, Ginger moved in love like she laughed, openly and easily, and I moved with her, against her, within her, an ocean of brown warmth. So she used these lists and carried them from dramatic moments to the mundane to her very self-definition. Again, the list. Black, lesbian, feminist, mother, warrior, poet. Leads me to my discussion questions, something for you to think about as we move into the discussion part of this. So, if these lists are a way of complicating a flat perspective with depths and complexities, locations and contradictions, how does Lorde employ these same techniques beyond the sentence level as she scales out to produce a nuanced character? And I'd like us to take a close look at chapter 11, which starts on page 71. From a character development perspective, the mother's character, how would you describe her prior to this point? And what shifts our perspective or perceptions here, starting around page 71? Why does Lorde choose this moment for this vignette? And from a structural perspective, looking at the memoir as a whole, what are the beats that punctuate the story? How are they connected to place? And how does place, descriptions of place, connect to the themes Lorde is exploring here?